Sahaya Deaf Kenya has been working with deaf children in schools for the deaf since 2004. And while at it, we've realized over the years that a lot of service providers, guardians, and even parents are not aware of what deafness is. And so as an organization, we decided that the best thing to do was to provide awareness to the service providers, guardians, and parents on who a deaf child is, to better understand how to deal with them. Deafness is simply inability to perceive sound. A lot of times people think it's daftness. We have mild deafness. And this is where, depending on the environment, someone can hear, but if it's noisy, they would struggle to hear. And then we have moderate deafness, where again, depending on the environment, someone can hear, but they would easily use a hearing aid to hear. All right? And then we have severe deafness, where someone has difficulty in hearing. They would just have to use a hearing aid. And then we have profound deafness. This is where someone is totally deaf. They cannot perceive sound. Under those four categories, we further classify them under what we call loss of sound perception. And this is where someone can be deaf because of being born deaf, or it could be hereditary as well. We have the other situations where someone falls deaf before they acquire speech. This means they do not learn how to speak. Their first language is sign language. Then we have postlingual deafness, where someone falls deaf after they've acquired speech. And then because of deafness later on, they acquire a new language, which is sign language, because now they have to go to an environment where there are more deaf people. Children go to a school environment where they learn the language. From our experience, most of the deaf that we've spoken to and parents of the deaf children that we've spoken to, they've become deaf out of sicknesses such as malaria, meningitis, mumps, measles. So most of children actually in the schools for the deaf that we deal with, parents attribute to the deafness after they acquired speech. So you find that most of the deaf we interact with, they're able to probably try and talk, though it is not clear, but they cannot hear. We have situations where children cannot hear. They have different ranges of loss of sound, but because of poverty, the parents cannot afford a hearing aid. So then, being deaf, they decide to fully follow the deaf culture. If mothers are expectant, clinical visits are important to monitor development of the fetus. Number two, we always urge parents and guardians that when a child is sick, no matter how far a place is, or no matter how, you're unable to afford, a government hospital can be visited and, they can offer help, timely help.
I am deaf. I grew up as a deaf person, and I have accepted it. I use sign language as my mode of communication.
A deaf person is also referred to as hard of hearing and uses hearing aids and may or may not talk. Most don't use sign language. The deaf community, just as other communities, have a set of learned behavior. They have language, norms, and traditions.
Deaf culture is deaf people's way of life. Deaf use sign language only, no other language. A hearing person who understands sign language is also considered deaf by culture. Deaf culture involves use of sign names. My sign name is fingerspelling names, waste time. First time I will fingerspell my name, but always I will sign my name. The second time I will sign my sign name. Same as Jackie, that's deaf culture.
Aspects of deaf culture include use of sign language, which involves use of hand movements, defined gestures, facial expressions, and body language to convey information. Use of sign names, entailing one's physical feature or character trait singled out to base a sign name for a person within the signing space. No titles are used, no matter who the person is. Signing space is just above the head, slightly below the waistline to determine average hand signing. Getting attention by tapping on the shoulder, asking someone near the deaf person to get their attention, or waving to get attention. Turn taking is vital in communicating for orderliness. One person signs at a time. There is also eye contact because sign language is visual. One breaks communication if there is no eye contact, unlike the hearing who can still talk without eye contact. Light is also very essential because the deaf use light to see each other very well. The deaf cannot communicate in the dark, and the lights shouldn't be too bright either. Freeing hands when one wants to sign. Passing around two signers to avoid breaking communication. A unique aspect of deaf culture is way of clapping that is soundless. Don't hit, punch, or throw an object. Don't lose eye contact as information is missed, considered rude, or the conversation terminated. Don't sign with hands full of objects as the sign listener will miss some communication. Never sign while eating or chewing because it inhibits mouthing and disfigures the facial expressions connoting the conversation area. Don't pass between two people signing.
When a deaf person wants to marry another deaf person, parents refuse and say, "You don't bring the girl home." The deaf suffer so much. Parents want you to marry a hearing girl. But me being deaf, I feel communication will be difficult if the girl doesn't understand sign language.
Parents deny deaf children the opportunity to go to secondary schools, even when they can, because parents think a deaf child can't. Parents oppress the deaf children and take them to a technical center. Yet the deaf children can advance in their education.
In a hearing church, it's difficult for a deaf person to understand a verbal sermon. But in a church for the deaf, it's easier to understand the sermon. Because there's a language connection, and this helps me develop. Sometimes the deaf would want to go with the hearing to watch football. But the hearing tend to have an attitude and think it's impossible. Because of communication barrier. Not knowing the deaf are skilled too and can write to communicate. A deaf person can apply for a job, but when a boss sees it's a deaf person, they quickly develop an attitude. They assume being deaf, you can't do anything.
The deaf have a challenge in the area of health. Hospitals have no interpreters, therefore, when a deaf person visits, there's communication breakdown. The doctors most times give wrong medication or diagnosis. Another challenge is when the police arrest a deaf person. The police end up beating the deaf person thinking the deaf person is rude. Later on, the police realize the person is deaf and didn't hear them. Some parents who have deaf children hide them. Other hearing children in the family will be empowered, but the deaf child will be hidden away. With no form of socializing.
One, we have the Constitution, which has recognized sign language, that it's a language for the deaf. And we are seeing a couple of media stations now have interpreters. My only wish is if they would probably just increase the caption. It is really small that sometimes I, who is hearing and understand sign language, I have difficulty reading, getting to understand the signs. So right now, there's definitely improvement. On education level, right now we have the government training special teachers. We have deaf themselves who are, P1 teachers and have been posted to the schools for the deaf. And I take pride in that because the first 10 pioneer teachers who were trained as P1 teachers, I was with them when they were going through this process. And they all passed, more than even some of us hearing. So right now we have about 60 deaf teachers, and that's a plus for schools for the deaf. On top of that, we have hearing people who have taken a need to go and do special education, and the government is posting them to the schools for the deaf. So definitely we see a situation where the educational standards for the deaf is going up. And I'm sure with time, this is going to breed the need for more secondary schools for the deaf, because right now we have about 90 schools for the deaf. Some are units, and out of it all, you only have 5 secondary schools for the deaf, because there's been no need for it. A lot of research probably needs to be done, to come up with such a number, But there is nowhere you can say you will go and get these records for the deaf. We really don't have that. What we have is just like the population of the deaf that we have worked with the schools for the deaf. We put it about 10,000. Deaf adults, it's hard to know. From my personal perspective, having worked with the schools for the deaf, one, if the organizations for the deaf were, well organized, I would say actually they would even be doing deaf awareness, so that not only the government but other service providers can get to know who a deaf person is and how to meet their needs.
Possibility here is that the hearing can learn sign language to communicate to the deaf, because it is impossible to become hearing. It is important to also have interpreters in various places, such as hospitals, courts, government offices. This will solve challenges in communication.